City Club member, and not standing for or against, but asking for clarification. When I read the report, I didn't see anything about the connectivity of our tax system to who we want to be, particularly things like the governor's sustainability order and so forth. So could you just answer what the connectivity is in terms of having things like green taxes and that sort of thing?
Don, over to you.
If I may, just to Gus's point first, I think in the first instance we were talking about the comparison overall to other states. In the second instance, we were in a discussion about the inability to produce the revenues as it's currently tilted toward the income tax. Again, the income tax is a great tax and a progressive tax in good times. In bad times, it isn't. I think to your point, Milt, that was why, in the brief time I had, I wanted to make sure I got across the point that as you start this review, start with policy goals. Don't start with let's do this tax or move that tax around the board. What do we want our tax system to bring us in Oregon in terms of not only revenue, but in terms of underpinning policy goals that the governor and the state legislature may want to see moved on. So I think your point's very important and very well taken.
Jane?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name's Jane Cease, and I, at one point, had either the fortune or the misfortune to chair the Senate Revenue Committee in the legislature. And during that time, we put out an advisory question to Oregon voters about what kind of a tax system they wanted. And to no one's surprise, and we had conversations with voters about it all over the state. And to no one's surprise, it was, you know, a third this, a third that, and a third that. That is one of the reasons that the state of Oregon has not, and I think the voters are probably still split all over the place, has not reached an agreement on the tax system. Personally, I think we used to have a fairly decent tax system, and I think now we've got a really messy, bad one. But it may be that the committee reflects the makeup of the public on the division of the different kinds of taxes. But this report has something that everybody can use no matter what kind of a tax system you prefer or want, and that is some very, very good criteria that the committee worked on and came up with, and no matter which direction the future is headed in terms of taxes, those criteria are really good ones to use, and I would urge everybody to support the report based on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. If there's no further discussion, the motion has been made for acceptance of the report. Do I hear a call for the question? The question has been called. We'll now proceed with the vote to adopt the report, which recommends approval of the report and its recommendations. Those in favor of this motion, please raise your cards. Opposed? The motion carries with not quite a unanimous majority. So the City Club membership has voted to approve the Tax Reform in Oregon report. Our thanks to Don and to members of the committee for a fine report, and also for the prescience of those who produced the bulletin, which announced adoption of the tax reform report. They should, of course, have referred to the Measure 7 report, which is the last one that we adopted. Moving on now, and welcome to our viewers. Good afternoon. I'm Paddy Tillett, the President of the City Club, and welcome to today's Friday Forum on Building Community Support for K-12 Education Reform. Our special guest today is Dr. Sonia Hernandez, President and CEO of the LAAMP Learn Regional Education Reform Alliance. But first, some announcements. Next week, on Friday, April the 26th, you have opportunities to join fellow club members for both breakfast and luncheon. At breakfast, our speaker will be the National Drug Czar, John Walters, who will talk about the President's initiatives and where Oregon stands in the drug war. That'll be here at the MAC. Doors will open at 7:30 a.m. for an 8 o'clock breakfast program. Our regular Friday forum at noon will feature Alan Homer, President of Pharma, who will talk about how and why it is that pharmaceutical drug prices are so high and what this means for the future of the Medicare program. That'll also be here at the MAC Club at the usual time. Please use the advanced registration coupons in this week's bulletin for a special gubernatorial forum on May the 1st. Former Governor Vic Atiyeh will challenge 5 of the 6 major gubernatorial candidates on a transportation issue that morning. By lunchtime, each candidate will have formulated a response that shows their mettle. That will be at noon at the Hilton Hotel on Wednesday, the 1st of May. The breakfast event that was planned to precede the gubernatorial luncheon posed conflicts for so many of you that we've decided to cancel it. Those of you who've already pre-registered for the breakfast will receive a refund. Registration and prepayment for the luncheon forum is due by Friday the 26th. Check our website, the bulletin, or call the club offices for more information. www.pdxcityclub.org. I'd remind you that you can now make luncheon reservations online and receive your weekly bulletin via email. If you prefer an electronic version of your bulletin, either leave your card with your email address with a staff member as you leave or call the club office. Anyone interested in obtaining a video or audio tape of this or any other City Club program may do so through the club office. Videotapes are $20 and audio tapes are $10. Call Suzanne for more information. Our board host, seated at the head table today, is Carol Witherell, member of the Board of Governors and Professor of Education at Lewis and Clark College. She will have the privilege of asking the first question of Dr. Hernandez. Following Carol's question, we'll open the program to questions from City Club members in the audience. Please be ready at the microphones with brief questions rather than declamations, and please identify yourselves as members of the City Club. Broadcast of City Club programs this quarter is made possible in part by corporate underwriting from Portland General Electric, from CH2M Hill, and from Providence Health System. We're very grateful for their support. Dr. Sonia Hernandez is President and CEO of the Los Angeles County Alliance for Student Achievement, a non-profit organization that serves one of the most diverse school districts in the country. In Los Angeles County, there are 1.7 million students on the rolls. Her conviction that students can attain higher education standards as a result of systemic reform of K-12 practices and infrastructure has been borne out by results. Many of those reforms may have applicability in Oregon. Dr. Hernandez has worked as a teacher, a principal, and administrator for school districts in Texas and Colorado. She was Director of Education for the state of Texas and held similarly prestigious posts in New York and California. From 1994 until last year, she served as Vice Chair to the President's Advisory Commission on Educational Excellence for Hispanic Americans. Her enduring passion is to ensure that all students are educated to high levels through quality public schools. As Oregon's public schools become more diverse and as the legislature strips away more of their funding, the issue of quality education of those who will inherit our state becomes ever more pressing. So today, Dr. Hernandez, you have an audience that heartily shares your aspirations for public education and is keen to discover how they may be attained. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Sonia Hernandez.
President Tiller, thank you very much for your very generous introductions. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I love getting in front of an audience to talk about public education. It has been my passion for 25 years, and hopefully it'll be the passion for the rest of my life. And quite honestly, as I've kind of looked at my career, I spent some time working in New York State, third largest state in the country, moved to Texas, which is actually my home, second largest, and moved to California. I had great hopes that my next career move would be Delaware or New Hampshire or a state that was among the smallest, because there is clearly a conviction, and I share that conviction, that actually smaller is better when it comes to teaching young people successfully. Now, when I came to Portland, I've been to Portland, this is a wonderful city. And in fact, in education circles, you're kind of the woebegone city, if you will, when it comes to public education, because you're so far and away better in terms of understanding what kinds of challenges schools face. So the level of understanding, the clarity around the needs of students is borne out and is understood much better here by the average citizen than just about anywhere else in the country. And that's extraordinary, and that's wonderful. Having said that, like most people, when I arrive in the city, one of the first people I meet is a cab driver. And so I met a cab driver last night, and he says, ma'am, where are you from? I said, Los Angeles. And he said, oh, why are you in Portland? And I said, well, I'm here to speak to some groups. There's a 10th anniversary of the Parents for Public Schools being held here in Portland this week, and I'll be talking to that group. And he says, public schools, boy, you got your work cut out for you. And I said, really? I said, why do you say that? He says, well, in my day, started waxing philosophically as cab drivers often do, in my day, it was reading, writing, and arithmetic. And now look at what you guys have done to public schools and all the stuff that kids have to learn, and it's not too surprising that things are in such dire straits. Well, okay, you got to admit, anywhere in the world you land, you've got cabbies with a real philosophical bent about things. And when it comes to public education, everybody understands it. Everybody wants to tell you what they think. And so I'm no different, if you will, even though my background is a little bit more steeped in the world of education. I am here to tell you that there are some very important things happening in public education that certainly Oregon has been at the lead, if you will, in making some extraordinary changes that the rest of the country is still yet to understand. Having said that, you're facing some of the same challenges, some of the same issues that in many ways we're all addressing throughout the country. Now, Los Angeles is quite a story in and of itself. Almost 1 million children in the Los Angeles Unified School District. They consider it a big success when they get about 1/3 of them reading on grade level. I don't consider that success when you have 70% failure. I don't consider it success when you've got more than half of your youngsters not graduating from high school. Some people say, well, that's better. You know, in the 60s, the dropout rate was more like 80%, and that's true. But in the 60s, if you dropped out of high school, you still had an opportunity to get a decent paying job if you didn't have a high school diploma. In this day and age, it is near impossible, and we know it. So I guess what I'm here to say to you is that one of the things that I hope that as a whole community, Portland stands together to support the basic tenets of good schooling, which is standards, assessment, and accountability. 3 vital, fundamental pieces that we can all talk about regardless of where we sit, regardless of what we're doing, regardless of how we do or do not interact with the public schools. But considering the tax debate you just had, you all interact with public schools one way or another. But looking carefully that standards, identifying what it is we want all students to know and be able to do is absolutely critical. You know, there's beginning to be some movement in the country that says, oh, well, you know, it's too hard to do. Well, of course it's too hard to do. It's very, very difficult to do. But until and unless we're very clear about what the expectations are for every single child, it's hard to measure whether we're being successful or not. It almost seems like such a common sense thing. But in fact, in education, it is still a relatively new concept, a relatively tough one. But being clear about what we want for all children is fundamental to a good system. The second piece of that triumvirate, which is assessment, is also an important piece. Now, there's a big backlash going on back east, particularly in places like Massachusetts, where there is a sense that, you know, we're overemphasizing tests. That we have to be careful with that. That tests have a tendency to limit what it is students are learning, has a tendency to limit what teachers are teaching. And, you know, we just don't want teachers to be teaching to a test. Well, let me step back a second on that one and unpack that little suitcase for you a little bit. In fact, measuring how well and what students are learning is fundamental to our system. If you don't have some kind of assessment to measure how students are doing, you won't ever know what kind of progress you're making. when you're asking people to make serious investments, millions and millions of dollars year after year, it's important to be able to say, we are making a difference. Where are we making a difference, and with whom are we making a difference? How can we ensure that the things that are being taught are actually being learned? And in fact, assessments are a pretty good way of doing that. Now, nationally, do we have to do things better when it comes to tests? Absolutely. Absolutely. We have to make sure that the kinds of tests that we're using with youngsters are appropriate to the things that they're being taught. My state has a little bit of dysfunction in that area. The state of California happens to have a test that doesn't happen to match its standards. Yes, that does cause some consternation, but we're working on it. We're working on it. And the intent is clearly that you have to measure what's expected to be taught. And that's absolutely fundamental to the system of standards-based reform. And the third piece, a critically important one that I hope you all share with me in terms of passion, and that is the issue of accountability. It is important to know, where does the buck stop? Who is accountable for what's happening? Being clear that we can no longer afford, as a country, to lay all of accountability on the student. Yes, students have to be responsible. Yes, they have to participate. Yes, we have to do everything that we can to make sure that we've engaged them in their learning. But bottom line, it is the adults who have created the system. It is the adults who spend the money. It is the adults who run the system. And we have to be accountable for doing everything that we can to ensure that children are learning the things that we have said they need to be learning. So accountability is an extraordinarily important tenet in this three-legged stool, if you will, of standards, assessment, and accountability. And I'm hoping that everyone here and everyone who's listening to my message today will say, absolutely. These are things that we can understand. These are things that we can see. These are things that we can support. And these are things that are good for all children. For all children. Now, the second part of my message, equally simple, but equally difficult in terms of execution. And that is, when you recognize the need to educate all children, and you're getting more and more immigrant children, and if you want the tabloid on how to do that right and wrong, come see LA. We have extraordinary level of immigration. We have many, many youngsters coming in whose language is other than English. But in listening to people from Portland this morning, I hear that you have 87 languages spoken in your schools, just like we do. Where you have many, many youngsters who are coming in from different cultures. And yet, we have to understand that the public school is still the common school that teaches everyone what it means to be an American. And so the support for public education, the support for the common school is an extraordinarily important one. But let me push that argument a little bit with you. This is actually the second part of my message. Who owns the responsibility for ensuring that we educate all children? It is, in fact, a civic responsibility. It isn't just the role of educators to educate all children. It isn't just the role of parents. It is, in fact, the responsibility, the obligation of the entire community to be engaged in that enterprise. Now, I have to tell you that my job, I love my job. It's the best job I ever had. Finally, somebody's paying me to be a troublemaker. Finally, somebody's paying me to be an agitator. I used to do it on my own, you see, in the jobs I held before, but it wasn't necessarily because someone expected it of me, but when they hired me, they kind of knew what they were getting. But now they actually expect that, and part of my performance is, how much did you agitate? And the people who hired me are primarily a group of business and civic leaders in the Los Angeles community. They understand clearly that it lies within the realm of the future of the region to support and to agitate on behalf of public education. And the agitation, by the way, in a very positive sense, that is to cause action, occurs at the national level, it occurs at the state level, it occurs at the local level. We believe strongly that it is a community responsibility to support public education as an enterprise. And what does that look like? Well, you know, we all have a piece of this. We all have a piece of this. Now, I know that Portland is undergoing some interesting times. You're looking for a superintendent, and trust me, you're not the only ones that are having a hard time with that one. Leadership is hard to come by, but not impossible. You've got a school board that you need to actually hold accountable for their actions. Now, whether you think they're right or wrong in this issue or any other issue, it is the responsibility of the community to watch carefully what's going on, to support them when they're doing the right sorts of things, and call them to question when they're not. That is the action. That is civic action on behalf of public education. It's interesting to note that when you build a coalition, what becomes civic action must become the civic imperative. In this case, the civic imperative is to make sure that we're educating all children. It is a civic imperative that we make sure that we're closing the achievement gap, because as we look at what's happening among African American youngsters, Latino youngsters, and Asian youngsters, actually there is beginning to be some serious sliding in terms of their performance compared to other groups. And you can't let that happen. You've got to stop that slide. That slide can be stopped, but only and if people understand that it is a civic imperative to educate every child to high levels. Now, how do you do that? The role of the business community, the role of citizens, is to be advocates on behalf of children, not on behalf of systems, not on behalf of specific leaders. You know, LA, again, is such a great example. Within 5 years, they had 4 superintendents. Within a matter of 10 years, they had several turnovers of the school board. What they lacked from the beginning, and one of the things that we're working on right now, is to come up with a blueprint for transformation of our schools. And if you want to be a superintendent in Los Angeles, then you're going to have to buy into what the community says. What the community says is a blueprint for the success of our schools. And if you want to run for school board, then you're going to have to support that agenda as well. But it is an agenda that is built from consensus. It is an agenda that's built by coalition building. It is a consensus that's built by partnerships that have never existed before. And that means that we have to work together. That means that we have to talk with people that we're not accustomed to speaking to. And the business community, let me make no mistakes about leaving this part of the message with you. The business community can be the extraordinary driver in a community that brings all of the partners together in some very, very important ways. What's at stake in this conversation? Very simply, the survival of your region, the survival of the quality of life that you've got, and the long-term future for Portland and for your state. Why do I say that? Let me give you a tale of 2 cities, very big cities, Los Angeles and Philadelphia. Today, they have no Fortune 500 companies left. The number of people and the percentage of people with bachelor's degrees is dropping precipitously. And we're talking about the native-born population, not about the immigrant population. We have much to lose. We have much to gain. The issue too often is that we have to find ways to work together, ways that we've never worked together. So here is my challenge to you, Portland. Agitate, organize, collaborate, and support public schools in ways that you haven't even thought of. It's important. And let me just leave you with this. The children of this city and of this state depend on all of us to take action, because truly, if we don't, who will? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering if you have considered running for superintendent. My question, you talked about civic action and civic imperatives. So my question is, what kind of citizens are we educating for? And is the emphasis on assessment in basic skills overshadowing this equally important goal of public schooling?
To your first question, I realized a long time ago that my life in public education needed to stay public but not political. Although I hear you've got some interesting times when it comes to that as well. Yeah, we do get concerned that assessment has a tendency to overshadow. And so, again, part of the civic involvement is making sure that there is a real balance, that there is a balance when it comes to this. There is enough information that we can gather without requiring extensive testing, without looking so much at just, kind of the fine lines of assessment. And we cannot lose sight of the importance of raising youngsters who are citizens as well. And that does take time, and that's not easily measured. As I say, life is not a multiple choice test. And we certainly wouldn't want it to be. And those things that we value can't always be measured that way, but we can find ways to document.
Hi, Chris Smith, club member. I want to connect something you said with some of the themes coming about our tax debate earlier in the meeting. I agree with you that it is a civic responsibility to educate our children to the highest level. But the tax structure in Oregon right now is being driven by populist campaigns that are probably much more about being careful consumers of government services than about being members of a civic society. It's about how can I get the most services for the least dollars. My question for you is, how can we use our children, our public education, to reconnect people and remind them that they are members of a civic society, not just a big consumer class?
Great question, but I think embedded in the question is actually the answer, huh? In fact, the notion that public education and working closely with children needs to be closely tied to the kinds of expenditures that we're making is part of our civic responsibility. And in fact, it's part of the responsibility of those people who are asking that you look at your tax structure, certainly your elected officials. And it seems to me that when you think about seriously connecting what happens with the dollars and what actually happens in the schools, it's also an important responsibility for all of us to pay attention to that. I'm not a great fan of bureaucracies. I'm not a real big fan. I mean, when I look at again, some of the large systems that I've worked in, I do question, what are we paying for? And making sure that we are sending as many of the dollars down to the school level where it can make the biggest difference is something that we ought to pay attention to. Because in fact, it is critically important that all of us get the sense of comfort that the money that we're putting in for public education is really going to educate children. But this is a tough issue. But connecting the dots and making sure that there's a close relationship is the only way that we're going to get the kind of public support to continue the investment in public education.
Yes, I'm Mitch Greenlick, a City Club member. In the coalition building, to get people and bring their ideas into the mix, how do you deal with an interest in bringing evidence-based knowledge into that? For example, we just are facing the closing of 2 small schools, and the evidence seems to suggest small schools perform better. How do you mediate between those kinds of interests?
Well, it's always kind of difficult when you start thinking about what is the most efficient way to spend the dollars that you have in public education, and smaller does seem to go contrary to that notion. But in fact, if you're really focusing on what is it that children need, and when you do that, one of the things that you have to do is you need to begin to get down to the small community level to figure out what it is exactly that the children really require. And for those who do better with smaller learning communities, then you have to find a way to make sure that the dollars actually support that. because there is that research base. But most of us don't live in the world of research. So when we know and when we have the evidence and when we have the facts, we need to be able to share them with folks. And like I said, this is one community that is very open and receptive, fertile ground for understanding those tough issues. So I think presenting the evidence and presenting the data that supports you, I think will go a long way in getting the kind of support that you need to make those tough decisions.
Hi, Jane Cease again, City Club member. Could you sort of get down to the nitty-gritty of what your coalition looks like? I mean, where the different pieces come from, and could you also give us sort of the ABCs of how you listen to the whole community, what pieces of the community you are getting to, or which ones are harder to get to in your experience? Just sort of the basic building blocks of how this works and how one might go about it.
Sure.
Thanks.
The building of supports has to happen in many different ways. For example, building the business community. In Texas, there is an organization called the Texas Business and Education Coalition. Statewide, very strong business supports around a set of tenants that really has fueled change in Texas for the last 15 years. They have been kind of the keepers of reform and have made sure that regardless of the changes in the administration, that kind of support has been there. Critical. We're building the same kind of business organization, the California Businesses for Excellent Education, CB, in California. We have the Education Roundtable in California, also focusing very, very closely on it. The truth is that you've got to get to some key business leaders who can work their networks and bring people together in very significant ways. But you also have the organizations that are civic organizations, such as the Urban League, the NAACP, MALDEF. We've joined and met with the organizations. We've talked to their leadership. We've addressed the issues and made sure that many of the issues that they're concerned about, issues of equity, are also our concern. And so we brought them in. The toughest, parents. The organizing of parents is the toughest work. Not because they're not interested, but because when you look at the scheme of all of the things that they're engaged in, getting them engaged in schools in a way that they feel that they're actually making a difference is very, very tough work. But community organizing, parent organizing is a fundamental building block in all of this. And if this doesn't happen, the likelihood is that you will get small groups of parents who really are not very representative of the whole. And that's where you might make some serious mistakes. So it's community by community, bringing people together and organizing them.
Thank you. Press, Dr. Ed Press, City Club member. You mentioned that standards, assessment, and accountability were major factors in there, and standards, of course, are one of the chief ones. In the old days, standards, reading, writing, and arithmetic, it didn't cost much to buy a reading primer. Now, standards, familiarity with computers is almost a required standard. That implies financing. Do you have a suggested standard or minimum finance requirement per student, per school, and if so, approximately what is it?
Well, that's getting right down to it, Doctor.
Well, that's what you need to know.
You're right.
How much money needs to be raised, and you don't want to raise more or less.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a very fair question. In fact, in education, we've not done that very well. But actually, the person who has done the best work in that is Dr. David Conley at the University of Oregon, where he's actually costed it out. When he started looking at all of the factors, what does it cost to educate a child well? And factored out the cost of facilities, the cost of teachers, et cetera. And he's actually come up with a set of factors that are worth looking at. The information in the commission report that gives you that information is available on the website for the Department of Education, the Oregon Department of Education. I wish I could tell you exactly what that number is. I don't remember.
What it is? You have a ballpark estimate?
No, I don't. I wish I could give that to you, but look at that website. It's an important key. Other states are beginning to follow Oregon's lead on that one, but it's great information.
Hello, my name is Pamela Heckinger. I'm from a local ethnic minority paper, and I'm just wondering what sort of challenges you see in educating all children to equal standards when you have such a culturally diverse population, especially in LA, and then what sort of steps can the community take to ensure that that does happen?
The value in it is actually one that is kind of fundamental in our belief system. We believe that all kids can learn to high levels. We believe that they need to be taught to reach those levels. In fact, we need to set a high level of standards, but our expectations is that there are many kids who are going to exceed that. It happened that when I was at the Department of Education, I served on the Standards Commission for the state of California that developed the standards. And we did set very high standards, for example, in science. But once you got into the high school standards, we knew that there were some kids who were destined to be scientists, and there were some, like my child, was destined to be an actor. Science was not his big deal. Mine was chemistry, believe it or not, and he got none of that gene. And so, quite honestly, there are some children who will want to excel in the arts. And so the standards for those who really want to use that as a focus area, have got to be even higher. But I think that there has to be a high baseline of expectation for all kids. And I don't think we can give up on that, regardless of what their background is, regardless of what their first language is. There should be no child graduating from any of our schools anywhere in this country who aren't perfectly fluent in English. It is, in fact, the language that gets us success and access. Now, hopefully, we would want children to know other languages as well, but if they fundamentally aren't fluent in English, then they're going to be sorely handicapped beyond belief, and that isn't what most parents want. So I do believe that there is a sense that we have to educate all children to very high levels, regardless of where they're coming from, and that in fact it is a part of the civic imperative that we need to have that level of educated citizenry. I think Thomas Jefferson said it better than I did, though.
Dr. Hernandez, my name is Monroe Sweetland. I'm a member of the club, and my slim qualifications to discuss this with you are based partly on the fact that many years ago I was chairman of the State Senate Education Committee and gone from the state for a while. I come back and I find our Education Committee, the City Club, is wrestling with the same problems and wrestling hard with them, but it's not a very successful product. And we haven't been able to provide the leadership that your visit may spark here, because I really think you have encapsulated all of our problems very well in your summaries today. I wanted to ask you, though, about one omission that I thought I detected.
Okay.
We have not succeeded. No, our present public school system includes not only the traditional groups that we all think about, but now the new emphasis on preschool and certainly the big emphasis on post-high school and community college work, and that's part of our public education system, even more maybe than in California. Have you found ways, because almost totally missing from all these discussions are the present student bodies of the high schools and community colleges of our state? No way do we really have participation. Can you give us some suggestions? Have you had any results with that level of the population? Thank you.
Excellent point, and your credentials are pretty extraordinary in this area. In fact, one of the things that we have been wrestling with in the state of California is trying to figure out what should be the master plan. California has had a higher education master plan for years and years and years. Back in the 60s it was developed, but didn't have one for K-16. Not K-12 at all, let alone K-16. And so notwithstanding pre-K through 16 now. And so we're actually in the process of adopting a pre-K through 16 master plan that looks at what is it that children need to know, what kind of support system do we need to build, what kind of pipeline do we need to create, because in fact, I don't know about Portland or Oregon per se, but we're suffering from an extreme shortage of teachers. And that's a really, really serious problem when almost 1/4 of the teachers in the Los Angeles Unified School District do not have a basic teaching credential. And that number is increasing. And so the issue of being able to engage our own students in many of these conversations is really a very, very critical one, because as much as adults like to figure out what it is kids need to know, be able to do, and how we're going to deliver the system, young people have a real good sense of what's happening and not happening in their schools and what would make a difference. And the problem is that we never organize ways to ask them. And so one of the things that I would urge you to do is to think about even putting together a panel of advisors of young people, of the youth of Portland, to provide you some guidance, to provide you some ideas. They're extremely, extremely, extremely knowledgeable, fluent, and very willing and able to give you some guidance and some information. But absent that, we will continue to make the same mistakes, not knowing how best to address what it is they see as the biggest challenges facing them in high schools. Why not enough of them, particularly when you look at ethnic minorities, et cetera, why many of them may go into community college and never go into a four-year institution. And once they do get into general academic institutions, what is the responsibility of those institutions in terms of expanding their student population to include those students? So I wish I could tell you that there was a very easy answer, but involvement of those groups in significant ways is actually quite doable. It's been much more successful at local levels than it has been at state levels.
Don Barney, City Club member. I was struck by your snapshot of the superintendent of schools situation in Los Angeles. 4 superintendents in 4 years. What happened there? What's happening to the job of superintendent of schools that we should understand here in this community or in any large city? It seems it's becoming less safe a place to be than a city manager's job.
Apparently there's another story there. In fact, the superintendency is a very, very, very tough job. My question to you is, who would want it? Most superintendents come in on a 4-3 vote. They're 1 vote away from losing their job. The minute they take one, they're trying to figure out where the next one is going to be. And in fact, it is fairly well borne out that most superintendents, particularly in urban districts, rarely last for more than a couple of years. So there is, and by the way, many communities are equally burned because in many cases they have to buy out a contract. So you're kind of stuck with, $250,000 to pay off this person when you're looking for someone else, and then that person is obviously having a difficult time looking at it. The situations they walk into are not always that good. I mean, besides not having a great deal of support, when they look around and they see disparate communities that aren't really coming together to support them, so who are their friends? Where are the allies that support the leadership that you need in the schools? You've got to create it. You've got to create it. It's at best a very, very tough job. But like I said, when you start looking at the odds, who would really want it? Having said that, there are some very excellent superintendents all across this country. When you get one, you try very hard to hold on to them. But it's not a pretty job, what can I tell you?
Dr. Hernandez, I'm Steve Schell, a member, and the City Club has a Charter Schools Committee underway, and I'd like to ask you a question about that. You've mentioned the standards and accountability and assessment is a key. I'm also concerned about impact. It seems to me that the charter school movement has a chance of serving Hispanics very well because it's focused and narrowed. You've had experience in New York and Texas and Colorado and now in LA. Can you give us some understanding of how you see charter schools working as to those questions about standards and accountability and assessment? And the fourth one of impact on school districts.
I happen to be a big fan of charter schools for lots of reasons. One is they have a tendency to be born within communities, out of community needs. They generally have a tendency to be much smaller, and as I said, smaller learning communities, I think, are important. When I walk into a charter school that has 200 children in elementary school, and I walk down the street where there's one with 2,000, I know if I had a youngster still in elementary school, I know where I'd want that child. And that many times is my measure, would I put my child in this school? And so when we look at what's happening with charter schools, you know, a lot of people say, aha, see, there goes another charter, it's folding. Well, I don't think that's bad news. I don't think that's bad news, because in fact, when a charter school folds after a couple of years, it still beats the record of a lot of public schools who've been around for 20 years, failing a community over and over, generation after generation. So the quick accountability when it comes to watching the dollars of how charter schools spent their money, I think is not a bad thing at all, and actually is a good model for public schools in general. When you look at standards and assessment, it's a mixed bag because charters will reflect their states. And there is no commonality, if you will, among the states in many, many cases when it comes to these issues. California only recently decided that it needed to ensure that the charter schools also had adopted standards and had to meet the same assessment requirements as the rest of the public schools. I actually think it's a good thing. The issue with charter schools, you make sure that they're meeting the same standards, you make sure that you're measuring it the same way, but you give them the latitude to be successful as needed to be with the population that they're serving. So that in terms of the impact of public schools, it keeps the public in public schools, but it increases the competition among public schools, and I don't think that's a bad thing either.
Dr. Hernandez, Milo Wormseth, member. As you described the situation of superintendency, it seemed to me that maybe one fix for that would be to look for the next superintendent right in town. And I wonder if there's any record or any statistics that have been kept on whether successful superintendents are more likely to have come from far away or more likely to have come from the home ground.
You know, I think a lot of that will depend on the job. What are you expecting of the superintendent in Portland? Are there huge changes to be made? If there are huge changes that you're expecting to be made within the system, then, as you know, and I know, and you know, all of our experiences have borne out regardless of where you work or what you do, and that is that outsiders have a much better chance of making the big changes. If the changes are not that large and dramatic, then oftentimes the inside person, the inside candidate, can be very good for either continuing on a blueprint for change that has already been initiated, or perhaps even carrying on the work that's already in place. So it just depends on what your expectations are. Again, whether it's an inside candidate or an outside candidate, what is it that they're walking into? Do they have the opportunity, for example, and you know, I'll be honest with you, if I were, and I'm not, a candidate for the superintendency, one of the things I would ask immediately is, do I have the capacity to be able to ask for the resignation of every person in the central office and then go back and hire who I need? And if the answer is no, thank you very much. You need to be able to give people the opportunity to create the organization that they need to do the work that you expect them to do. And so, yes, it is tough. And there's a saying that this friend of mine shared with me this morning that I will share with you if there are no more questions. It is this, and that is that school systems don't change because they see the light. School systems change because they feel the heat.
I'm not going to let you off quite so easily. We've got another question from the floor, which I'd like to ask you. Portland Public Schools has a strategic plan developed through a recent board-based public process. Our most recent superintendent was forced out partly because he wasn't implementing the plan. How can we move from broad rhetoric and superficial change to the deep and significant changes called for in the plan? And what sort of role can the Portland Schools Foundation play in this? I ask it because it seems a logical follow-on from what you just said.
Portland Schools Foundation, I think, is an extraordinary organization that you have based here that can be, and I think has been actually, a leader in helping to forge the path when things get a little tough. It always is better when you have the blueprint in hand, when you have the strategic plan, whatever you want to call it, and then you base your questions and your accountability and your hiring decisions around, are you willing to support this plan? I don't know about your previous superintendent, but if in fact your previous superintendent was not making gains towards your strategic plan, and there is general agreement in the community at all levels that this was the right thing to be doing, then you did the right thing. I don't think there's any question that public education funds, local education funds, and my organization happens to be one as well in LA, although we're very new at this. In fact, they can be the strong advocate voice, and they can help to bring together the disparate parts of the community that really does turn the heat up when it's needed. I don't think you should be shy about that. You know, one of the things that we learned from the Greeks is this whole notion of civitas, or what it means to be civic. It means to be engaged. It wasn't an invitation. It was a requirement of citizenship. It was a requirement of citizenship. Now, we've obviously bested the Greeks because they didn't think women should be included, and hey, what can I say? More than 50% of the population, you're just not going to leave us out this day and age, nor should you. But you see my point. It is not just a nice thing to do. It is not just, you know, a good thing to do on a Saturday morning. It is a civic responsibility and a duty. And where you can join, where you can find the points of light, the leadership, to take you into that discussion, go for it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hernandez. You've given us some sound advice, and I hope that we're now able to act on it. We're adjourned. Thank you.